The oppressive summer heat clung to the air like a heavy, suffocating blanket, the kind that made every breath feel thick and labored. The air itself seemed to shimmer with the weight of it, as if the very atmosphere was saturated with the scorching sun's relentless grip. The pungent scent of diesel fumes lingered in the cab, a constant, acrid reminder of the miles I had already covered and the ones yet to come. It was a smell that never truly left, clinging to my clothes, my skin, and the upholstery of the truck, seeping into the fabric of my life like an indelible stain. The rhythmic hum of the tires rolling endlessly over the hot, sun-scorched asphalt was a sound I had come to know intimately, a lullaby of sorts, albeit a harsh one, that echoed in my bones. It was the kind of sound that became a part of you, as familiar as the beat of your own heart, as constant as the sun's scorching rays. The tires rolled on, an unbroken melody that stretched for miles in every direction, with no end in sight. Each mile seemed to blend into the next, the landscape a blur of heat waves and distant horizons that never seemed to get any closer. The road, I realized, was more than just a path from one point to another. It had become something deeper, something almost alive. It was a living, breathing entity, a creature with a pulse that throbbed beneath the cracked pavement and the faded lane markings. The road was an endless ribbon, winding and twisting through the world, carrying with it the weight of countless journeys, each one carrying its own story. Some of those stories were told in whispered voices, others were shouted in anger, but they all shared the same endless road, the same unyielding journey. And as I continued down it, mile after mile, I couldn't help but feel a part of something much larger than myself. I had always loved these trips with my dad, the long hauls that felt less like simple drives and more like grand adventures, where the entire country unfolded before us like a vast, ever-shifting tapestry. Each journey felt like stepping into the unknown, a fresh chapter in a story that was constantly being written. From the moment we pulled out of our driveway, leaving behind the familiar, comforting world of home, I felt the unmistakable surge of excitement that only the open road could bring. It was a feeling I had come to crave, a sense of freedom, of possibility, as we left everything behind and ventured into the horizon. The cab of the truck, with its worn leather seats and the hum of the engine beneath us, became my own small kingdom, my domain where I could find both solitude and connection. It was a space that was entirely ours, filled with the scent of old coffee and the faint trace of the air freshener hanging from the mirror. Inside that small, mobile world, I could watch the land blur past through the window, the scenery shifting with every mile we covered. The distant mountains rose before us like silent giants, their peaks draped in mist and shadow, watching over us as we rolled through valleys and plains. And above it all, the sky stretched out wide and endless, a vast canvas of blues and purples, so open and expansive that it felt as though nothing in the world could reach us, nothing could touch us. It was as though the road itself was a barrier, protecting us from everything outside, and the world seemed to shrink into the background as we journeyed forward. The CB radio was never silent for long, always alive with bursts of static and the grovelly voices of truckers exchanging stories, warnings, and friendly banter. It was a language all its own, a coded system of respect and camaraderie that only those who lived by the road could truly understand. These men, gruff, weathered, and bound by the same relentless miles, looked out for one another like an unspoken brotherhood, an unwritten code that was followed without question. There was safety in that bond, a sense of belonging that I had never quite found anywhere else. The world outside our cab was unpredictable, sometimes beautiful, sometimes dangerous, but in that truck, with my dad at the wheel and the road stretching endlessly ahead, I had always felt untouchable. This trip was meant to be just like the countless others before it, miles of open road stretching endlessly behind us, another town, another stop, another fleeting pause before the journey continued. The sun was sinking lower in the sky, bleeding hues of deep orange and dusky purple across the horizon, its fading light stretching long, distorted shadows over the endless stretch of highway. As we rumbled toward the truck stop, the familiar glow of neon signs cut through the encroaching darkness, flickering and humming, some steady, others struggling to hold their brilliance against the night. This was just another pin on the map, another outpost along the vast artery of America's trucking highways, a place where the road-worn gathered in temporary respite. It was the kind of stop I had seen 100 times before: weathered gas pumps, a dingy diner promising the best coffee on the road, and a scattering of semi-trucks parked in uneven rows, their hulking frames idling in the dark like slumbering beasts. The thick scent of grease, fuel, and burned coffee lingered in the humid air, mixing with the distant aroma of cheap fried food wafting from inside the convenience store. The place was alive, but in a way that felt detached, transient. Truckers milled about, stretching stiff legs, swapping stories in low, gravelly voices that carried over the mechanical growl of diesel engines. Some sat slumped at the worn picnic tables near the entrance, their faces illuminated by the dim glow of overhead lights, hands curled around styrofoam cups of coffee that steamed into the cooling air. Nearby, a wrench clanged against metal, sharp and jarring against the otherwise steady hum of activity, a sound that spoke of repairs being made under dim floodlights by men who had long since learned to navigate the underbelly of their rigs in near darkness. It was a place that existed outside of time, a pit stop for the restless, a brief sanctuary for those whose lives were measured in miles rather than moments. And, for all its routine familiarity, for all the times I had watched my dad pull into places just like this, something about this stop felt different, though I couldn't yet put my finger on why. Then, without warning, the CB radio crackled to life, cutting through the steady hum of idling engines and the distant murmur of truck stop chatter. At first, it was just static, the usual white noise that faded in and out between conversations, but then came the voices, low, rough, edged with amusement that sent an involuntary shiver down my spine. There was something in their tone, something oily and wrong, a slithering kind of laughter that made my stomach tighten with unease before I had even processed their words. And then I did. What started as vague, muttered remarks quickly unraveled into something vile, words thick with lecherous intent, spoken with an ease that suggested these men had done this before, had talked like this before, without fear of consequence. They were talking about me. Not in a way I understood at first, not in a way my 14-year-old mind could immediately decode, but the weight of their words pressed against me, suffocating, wrong. Their voices oozed through the speakers, slow and deliberate, each syllable dripping with filth. They spoke of what they wanted to do to me, things so grotesque, so explicit, that even now, years later, the memory of it makes my stomach lurch. It was casual for them, like discussing the weather, like talking about a meal they planned to devour. Their laughter, lazy and unbothered, twisted the knife deeper. They weren't just saying these things to amuse themselves, they were enjoying the reaction they imagined they were provoking, feeding off the power they thought they had. At that moment, the CB, once a familiar and comforting voice of the road, became something sinister, a portal through which something dark and repulsive slithered into our cab, into my world. And as my brain struggled to piece together the full meaning of their words, I realized, with a sickening drop in my gut, that I wasn't entirely sure I wanted to understand. I was only 14, young enough to not fully grasp the depth of the filth spilling through the speakers, but old enough to sense the shift in the air, the way it thickened with something ugly and dangerous. Their words, laced with venomous intent, crawled over my skin like a sickness, slow and suffocating, leaving behind a feeling I couldn't shake. My stomach twisted into knots, an unfamiliar, primal fear settling deep inside me, coiling tight around my ribs. The weight of what they were saying didn't hit me all at once, not in the way it did my father. But I could feel it through him, through the way his body went rigid in an instant, the way his fingers tightened around the steering wheel until his knuckles turned bone white, tendons straining beneath his skin. His jaw clenched so hard I thought his teeth might crack, his breathing turning sharp, controlled, deadly. Then, with a suddenness that made me flinch, he lunged forward, snatching the CB mic with a force that made the cord strain against its coil. His entire body was vibrating with fury, not the kind of anger I had seen before when he was frustrated with bad drivers or long delays, but something far deeper, far darker. This was rage in its purest form, unfiltered, raw, and lethal, the kind of anger that could shatter bones, that could make a man do things he could never take back. When he spoke, his voice was a low growl, edged with something sharp and violent, something that carried a promise of blood. It wasn't just a warning, it was a declaration, a line being drawn in the sand. And I knew, without question, that my father was ready to cross it. "That's my daughter, you sick sons of bitches," he growled, his voice low and seething with unrestrained fury. Spitting venom into the airwaves, his words cut through the static like a blade. "She's 14. 14. The weight of those words hung in the air, thick with dread, and there was no hiding the savage protectiveness in his tone. A tense silence stretched for a moment, suffocating the space between us. And then came the laughter. It wasn't light or nervous, but slow, deliberate, and full of malice. It was the kind of laughter that made your skin crawl, like a predator savoring the sound of its prey's panic. "Well, that don't change nothin'," one of them sneered, his voice dripping with contempt and cruelty. "She's still got that." Before he could finish, my dad's rage exploded with terrifying intensity. His fist came down hard onto the dashboard, slamming it with a force that made the entire truck shudder, the violent thud reverberating through the vehicle like a shot fired into the still night. The impact was so sudden and powerful that it rocked us all, sending a jolt through my body, and I could feel the tension in the air tightening like a coiled spring about to snap. It was a jarring reminder of just how close he was to losing control, the fury barely contained beneath the surface, simmering just out of sight. His anger was tangible, filling the cab with an almost suffocating heat, the kind that presses in on your chest and makes it hard to breathe, like the thick, heavy air just before a thunderstorm. You could feel the storm brewing inside him, the raw energy, the force that had nowhere to go but outward. It was an unsettling, powerful thing to witness, his anger, so palpable and fierce, leaving no room for doubt that everything was about to change. Without a second thought, he grabbed the mic and jammed it down, the action so swift and sudden it felt almost instinctual. The result was immediate and jarring, an ear-piercing screech erupted, sharp and high-pitched, so loud and deafening that it seemed to tear through the air itself. The sound was raw and shrill, like metal grinding against metal, reverberating through the cab and deep into my bones. The feedback sliced through the moment with brutal precision, a sharp, electric interruption that cut off everything else. It drowned out their words in an instant, silencing their sneers, their taunts, and the cruel, mocking tone in their voices. For just a brief, fleeting moment, everything was drowned out by the chaos of the noise, leaving nothing but that raw, unbearable sound to fill the space between us. I shrank deeper into my seat, my whole body rigid with tension, every muscle coiled tight, as if I were a spring about to snap. My heart pounded violently in my chest, each beat reverberating in my ears like the frantic drumming of a trapped animal desperately trying to escape its cage. My face burned with a mix of shame, embarrassment, and confusion, a rush of heat that felt as though it was coming from deep within, each emotion stinging me in waves that I couldn't seem to shake. I couldn't wrap my mind around the cruel words they had said, the venom in their voices that had cut through the air with such ease, or understand why they were spewing such horrible things. It was like the world around me had turned into a blur, my thoughts clouded in a haze, struggling to make sense of what was happening. But amidst the confusion, there was one thing I could see with chilling clarity, the raw, dangerous fire burning in my dad's eyes. He looked like a man on the very edge, a fuse just about to burn out, ready to explode. It was as if he might tear the door off its hinges, throw himself out into the unknown, and unleash whatever fury had built up inside him. The look in his eyes made it clear, there was no telling what he might do next. The air inside the truck grew thick, heavy with the unspoken weight of anger and fear that seemed to press down on everything around us. It was as if the very atmosphere had changed, becoming dense with the tension that radiated from my dad. I could feel every second stretch on unbearably, each moment dragging painfully, suffocatingly, as though time itself was holding its breath in anticipation of what might come next. And then, without any warning, he moved. It was quick, sudden, and deliberate. His hand shot down beneath his seat, his movements sharp and precise, as though he had rehearsed them 1,000 times. His fingers, strong and steady, curled around the cold, metallic handle of his revolver. The weapon seemed to settle into his hand naturally, almost as if it had been made for him, its heavy weight a dark reminder of what was simmering just beneath the surface. In that instant, it was impossible to ignore the truth. His fury had long ago surpassed words, it had transcended logic and reason. It was no longer just anger, it was something raw, something primal and untamed, a force that could no longer be contained or controlled. The weight of it hung in the air, suffocating and inevitable, and I knew, in that moment, that there was no turning back. With a single, violent motion, he threw open the door. The sound was deafening, a sharp crack as the door smashed against the side of the truck, rattling the vehicle slightly from the force. The night, thick with the oppressive silence of the empty lot, seemed to swallow him up instantly, but I could still hear him, his voice cutting through the air like a war cry, raw and fierce, rising above the distant hum of the parking lot. It was a sound that made everything inside me tighten, a sound that filled the space with tension and fear, because I knew that when he spoke like that, there was no going back. "Who the hell are they?" he roared into the night, his voice raw with fury and disbelief. "Which one of you sick bastards said that?" His words cut through the quiet like a knife, harsh and unforgiving, carrying the weight of a threat that no one would dare ignore. The sound of his voice seemed to ripple through the air, waking others from their slumber. One by one, truckers began to emerge from their cabs, their heavy boots hitting the pavement with a dull thud, signaling their presence. These weren't just any men, they were veterans of the road, each one a product of years spent navigating the harsh, unforgiving terrain of long hauls and endless highways. Their faces were weathered, etched with deep lines and creases, the kind of hard-earned marks that only decades of constant travel and grueling labor could carve into a person's skin. Their eyes, sharp and unwavering, were like cold steel, cold from witnessing more than most could even begin to fathom. They had seen violence in its rawest form, betrayal that cut deeper than any blade, and the kind of gritty survival that had forged a silent, unspoken understanding of the rules that governed their world. Those rules, as rigid and unforgiving as the asphalt beneath their feet, were clear now. Some things, no matter the cost, were simply never to be tolerated. And whatever had just unfolded, whatever had been said or done, crossed that line. And this, what had just been said, what had been done, this was one of those things. The Brotherhood had been called to arms, and there was no turning back now. The men who had gathered were not just truckers, not just workers of the road. They were a brotherhood bound by an unspoken code, and that code had been broken. And when the code was broken, there were consequences. A chorus of voices erupted in response, a cacophony of raw, determined anger. Some of the men were already reaching for their CBs, their fingers deftly working the buttons as they scrambled to pinpoint the direction of the pervert signal. Others, their faces set with grim resolve, climbed into their rigs, the engines roaring to life with a deafening growl. They weren't just random men, it wasn't just the call of any trucker looking for a fight. These were fathers, brothers, protectors, men who had long ago made a silent pact to look after those who couldn't defend themselves. They had daughters, sisters, wives, their hearts filled with a protective rage that only a loved one could inspire. This wasn't just a matter of pride or reputation, this was something much deeper, something personal that struck at the core of who they were. Every word spoken, every threat made, every act of cruelty aimed at a woman or child fanned the flames of anger inside them, a fire that burned hotter and fiercer with each passing moment. It was a fire that couldn't be put out easily, no matter how hard you tried to douse it. The rage these men felt wasn't fleeting, it was an enduring blaze that had been stoked by years of life on the road and the countless injustices they had witnessed. They had seen the darker side of the world, and they understood that some lines, once crossed, demanded action. These men, weathered and scarred by years of hard miles and tougher experiences, had learned long ago to stand up for what mattered, to protect the vulnerable at any cost. They were no strangers to violence, to confrontation, but this wasn't about survival anymore, it was about justice. They were prepared to take matters into their own hands, knowing that the law might not move fast enough, or at all. They were determined to find these sick bastards who had crossed the line, and when they did, there would be no hesitation, no mercy. There would be retribution, swift and unrelenting. I sat frozen in the cab, my body stiff with a mixture of fear and disbelief, as my pulse thudded like a wild drumbeat in my ears. The sound of it seemed to echo in the confines of the truck, a frantic rhythm that matched the chaos unfolding outside. My mind was a blur, still reeling from the fury in my dad's voice, his words echoing in my head with a terrifying clarity. They weren't just words, they were a warning, a declaration, laced with something dark and primal, something that made the air thick with menace. Gonna kill them. The weight of those words hung in the space between us, heavy and suffocating. They weren't a threat, they were a promise, one that he was willing to follow through on, no matter the cost. And that realization sent a chill down my spine. This wasn't just about defending his family anymore, this was something deeper, something raw. And I couldn't escape the fact that I was now a part of it. The truck stop erupted into chaos, a full-fledged storm of movement and noise. Flashlights cut through the darkness, their beams erratic and sharp, while tires screeched against the pavement in a frantic rush. Engines roared to life with a deafening growl, the deep rumble of powerful machines that were more than just tools of the road, they were now weapons of vengeance. Men called out descriptions, their voices hoarse and urgent, as they scanned the lot like wolves on the hunt, searching for any sign of the bastards who had crossed the line. My dad was at the payphone now, his fists pounding against the receiver as he slammed numbers into the keypad with a kind of desperation that made the air around him vibrate with intensity. His voice, sharp as broken glass, cut through the static on the other end of the line, his words a razor's edge as he barked demands into the phone. He wasn't just calling the company those men worked for, he was calling everyone. The state police, the trucking authorities, anyone who might stand with him in this moment. There was no line he wouldn't cross, no door he wouldn't pound on. His threats were not idle words spoken in the heat of the moment, they were promises, deadly and unyielding. He was a man on a warpath, his rage a force of nature, and he wasn't stopping until those responsible were found. Justice would be served, one way or another. They work for you. Good. Then you'll handle this, or I swear to God, I will. His voice was low, cold, and deadly serious, each word weighed down with a force that left no room for doubt. It wasn't a request. It was a command, one that cut through the air with all the finality of a gunshot. There was no escaping it, the tension hung thick, suffocating everything around us. I sat there, frozen, small and numb, my hands trembling slightly in my lap. The shame curled around my ribs like a vice, tight and unforgiving, pressing in until it felt impossible to breathe. My mind was a fog of confusion, each thought feeling more jumbled than the last. What had just happened? What had I done? The fear was there too, creeping along my spine like a cold shadow, but it wasn't the fear of what was coming, it was the fear of not understanding. Had I done something wrong? Was this all somehow my fault? Why had they picked me, out of everyone? The questions gnawed at me, relentless and brutal, as I struggled to piece together what was happening, why this was happening. I swallowed hard, the sensation dry and raspy, as though my throat had turned to dust. The weight of everything pressing down on me made it feel impossible to take a normal breath. My mouth felt like it was filled with sand, and the hollow, parched feeling spread quickly, choking back any words I might have tried to say. I wanted to disappear, to shrink into nothingness, to vanish into the dark and be far, far away from all of this. The desire to be invisible, to erase myself from the nightmare unfolding around me, was overwhelming. I wanted to be anywhere else, but here, anywhere where I didn't have to feel this crushing, suffocating reality. At some point, the chaos began to settle, like the calm after a storm. The frantic movements slowed, and the blaring of engines dimmed as the men who had caused all this unrest were finally identified. Their plates had been recorded, their company name logged for anyone who needed it. Miles down the road, their voices, once so loud and defiant over the crackling CB, faded into the distance, becoming nothing more than a distant hum lost to the night. But even as the physical evidence of their presence diminished, their words hung in the air, thick and heavy, like a toxic cloud that refused to dissipate. They lingered, oppressive and suffocating, long after the trucks had disappeared into the blackened horizon. The lingering echoes of their cruelty felt as real as the exhaust still curling from the stacks of the idling rigs, twisting upward, invisible but undeniable. My dad came back, breath heavy, his face still a mask of rage. He slid back into the seat, gripping the wheel so tight I thought it might break under his hands. He didn't speak. Not for what felt like an eternity. The silence stretched on, thick and heavy, the kind that presses down on you and makes it hard to breathe. Every second seemed to stretch longer, the weight of unspoken words between us growing heavier. My mind raced, trying to make sense of everything, but all I could do was sit there in the oppressive quiet, waiting for him to break it. And then, finally, his voice cut through the stillness. It was quieter now, softer in tone, but it still carried the same undeniable force, like the calm before a storm. "You don't tell your mom." His words landed like a stone in the pit of my stomach, cold and heavy, leaving me with a feeling of dread I couldn't shake. The command in his voice was unmistakable. It wasn't a request, it was a rule, set in stone, and I had no choice but to obey. I nodded, my throat tight, unable to muster the strength to speak, my eyes focused on the floor, unable to meet his gaze. The shame, the fear, and the confusion twisted inside me, a knot that I couldn't untangle. The silence between us grew again, suffocating, as I grappled with what had just been said and what it all meant. And just like that, without another word, we pulled back onto the road, the engine's low rumble filling the silence as the truck began to roll forward. The mountains loomed in the distance, their jagged peaks cutting into the night sky, bathed in the cold, eerie glow of the moonlight. The soft light gave the landscape an almost surreal quality, casting long shadows and making the world feel suspended in time. The night stretched on endlessly, swallowing the last remnants of the truck stop behind us, erasing the chaos and tension like it had never existed. The road had always been my escape, the endless stretch of asphalt that promised freedom, adventure, and the kind of solitude that made me feel untouchable. It had been my second home, a place where the noise of the world faded away, and all that mattered was the journey. But after that night, something had shifted. The air felt heavier now, thick with a tension that wasn't there before. The familiar hum of the tires on the road no longer comforted me. No, now it seemed to echo with something darker, something that I couldn't quite name, but that gnawed at the edges of my mind. The horizon, once a promise of new places and new starts, now seemed like a long, empty expanse leading toward an uncertain future. The world outside the truck, once wide and full of possibility, felt suddenly smaller, darker. As the years passed, that night never truly left me. It stayed with me, lurking in the corners of my mind, resurfacing at odd moments, when the road stretched on endlessly before me, or when the quiet seemed too heavy. I would often find myself drifting back to that truck stop, to the cold, tense air, and the words that hung between us like an unspoken promise. I couldn't shake the feeling that something inside me had changed that night, that something I'd once held as my refuge had become something darker, something I wasn't sure I could trust. But over time, I learned how to carry it with me, to reflect on it without letting it consume me. The road, once a symbol of escape and freedom, became something more complex. It was still my escape, yes, but it was also my reminder. It reminded me of the thin line between right and wrong, of how easily a single decision could change everything. And while the fear that had gripped me back then would occasionally resurface, like a shadow that never quite fades, I knew I couldn't let it define me. I couldn't let it control me. I started talking about it, sharing what I could with the people who mattered, taking ownership of the experience, instead of letting it hold power over me. There was strength in that, in naming the fear and confronting it head-on. Slowly, I began to see the road for what it truly was, a journey, not just physically but emotionally, too. I had faced something that night that had tested my very sense of safety and trust, and yet, here I was, still moving forward. The road didn't seem quite as dark anymore. The shadows that had once seemed so overwhelming faded into the background, and the glow of the moonlight, once so eerie, started to feel like a guide. I had learned that fear, when confronted, loses its power. And though the memory would always linger, it was no longer something that held me back. It was just part of my story, part of the experience that had shaped me into who I was now, stronger, more resilient, and unwilling to let fear dictate my path. The road was still my second home, but it had become something more, a place where I could face the darkness and still find my way back to the light.